Now we know what a classified balance sheet is. It's just a balance sheet broken into current and non-current sections. We need to look at what the current and non-current assets are. What's the difference between both? So what we'll do is look at the definitions. So the definitions of current assets we're going to put here, and the definition of non-current assets we're going to put here. There's going to be 4 parts, and you go, well, I've got to remember more stuff. You actually don't, because the first 3 parts are going to be the same as our definitions that we used earlier when we looked at what an asset is. So we could say the first thing for both a current and non-current asset is they're both a present economic resource or benefit. The second part for both is they're both controlled by the entity. And the third part for both is that they both arise as a result of past events or a transaction. So that's the same. You don't need to learn anything different. What is different is this last little bit. How are these two different? Well, we will say a current asset is one that is held primarily for the purpose of resale or trading, as in I intend to buy it and sell it. That's my business. Whereas a non-current asset is one that is not held for the purpose of resale. Now, there's a couple of little things here we need to know, because you go, well, hang on, cash. What? Do I hold cash to resell it? That doesn't make any sense. So what we want to do is say, well, look, current asset is one that's held primarily to resell, or it could be an asset that is reasonably expected to be converted to cash, or is already cash, sold, or consumed by a business within the next 12 months. So now we can say, oh, hang on, this could be inventory, right? That's why we buy inventory. The purpose of it is to resell it, or cash, accounts receivable, and so on. Anything that I expect to be converted to cash, sold, or consumed within the next 12 months. That is a little bit different to non-current assets, whereas we say that we don't buy them to resell them. That is not the purpose. We don't do that. We buy them so we can use them. And a non-current asset is one that is reasonably expected to be used by the business for more than the next 12 months. So if you want to keep it real simple, go current assets, all the assets that I'll expect to have for the next 12 months, whereas non-current assets are all the ones that we expect to have for longer than 12 months. So there's 2 sort of differences here. The first one is we always want to ask, do we hold this type of asset primarily to resell or trade it? And the second difference is, how long do we think we'll own or use the asset for? So let's take an example. Some are going to be easy and you're just going to learn them through the course of the year. But if you're ever confused, you just want to remember some general rules. Bank or cash. Is that current or non-current? We're going to say that's always current. It's assumed that all cash will be spent within 12 months. That might not be true, but that's what we're going to assume. Inventory is always going to be a current asset. We will assume that all inventory will be sold within 12 months. That might not be true. Some businesses might take longer than that, but for our purposes, that is what we're going to do. Inventory, always current. Accounts receivable, someone that owes me money because they bought from me earlier and haven't paid. Well, again, we're going to assume current. Will everyone pay me back within 12 months? I don't know, but we are going to assume that they will. So they'll be a current asset. And one we'll come across later in the course is something called GST receivable. And that's when the government's going to give me a refund. And we will assume that will always be within 12 months. So if we can just remember this, we really don't need to remember that definition too much, because we know these are the ones we're probably going to see the most of. They're going to be current. Just got some odds and ends, some difficult ones. What about a car, or say a laptop, or a building? Okay, is that current or non-current? Well, it all depends. So what we want to do is ask these 2 questions. Do we hold this type of asset primarily to resell or trade it? And how long do we think we'll own or use it for? And that will help us classify it. And it all really depends on who we are. So why don't we say we are Nissan, car manufacturer, and this car is a car we've made. Why did we make it? Well, we primarily make cars to resell them. So really this car is actually inventory to us. Okay, now if it's inventory, we don't really need to think too much here, because we assume inventory will all be sold within 12 months. That's what we just said. So therefore that's current, and we would call that inventory. What about if I'm Nissan and I've got all these laptops in the office? Do we hold this type of asset primarily to resell or trade it? No, we don't. We don't buy laptops to sell them. We buy laptops to use them. Now, can we reasonably assume that we think we'll have this asset for longer than 12 months? I think that's very reasonable to assume a laptop will last for and be used for longer than 12 months. So therefore, this would be a non-current asset. We think we'll use this for longer than 12 months. Non-current asset called computers. And a property that we use, like let's say a head office. No. Do we hold this type of asset primarily to resell or trade it? No, we're not. Nissan isn't in the business of buying and reselling properties. We use them. So therefore, I think it's reasonable to assume a building will last for more than 12 months. So that would be a non-current asset called property. Let's just take a slight difference. The exact same assets, but let's say we are now Apple. So let's go back to the car. Apple owns cars, for its executives and to move things around, deliveries and such. Do we hold this type of asset primarily to resell or trade it? No. Apple's not in the business of selling cars. So they don't buy vehicles primarily to resell them. They use them in their business. How long is it reasonable to assume you would own a car for? How long will that car last for? It is reasonable to assume it will last for longer than 12 months, okay? So therefore, we would call that a non-current asset called vehicles. What about all the Apple laptops that we make? Why do we make them? What is their primary purpose? It is primarily to sell them. That's what Apple does. That's its business. So really, this is actually inventory. So is inventory current or non-current? Well, we said we'll just assume that all inventory is sold within 12 months. So if it's within 12 months, that's a current asset called inventory. Now the property is going to be the same. Apple is not in the business of making properties, so they don't buy a property primarily to resell it. They use it in their business. And we can reasonably assume a property will last for or be used for longer than 12 months. So that would be a non-current asset called property. So I guess it all comes down to these two questions. Do we buy it basically to resell it? In which case we do. If we do, it's called inventory, and that's current. Otherwise, if it's one that you're confused about, how long do you think it will last for? And if it's longer than 12 months, we would say that's non-current. Let's just take a really silly example, like a pen. Or maybe not one pen, but $50 of stationery for any business. Do they hold this asset primarily to resell or trade it? Nissan doesn't buy and sell pens. Apple doesn't buy and sell pens. What about Officeworks though? So that's going to be a bit different. So for Nissan, we'd say, no, we don't buy pens to resell them, we use them. Okay, but is it reasonable to assume that a pen will last longer than 12 months? Well, now we get a bit of a judgment call. But I don't think most pens probably don't last longer than 12 months. So if we don't sell it, but we don't think it'll last longer than 12 months, well, that's going to be a current asset, but it's not going to be called inventory, it's going to be called stationery. Now, the same for Apple. They don't buy and sell pens. So now it becomes a question of, do we think we'll own or use the asset for longer than 12 months? Probably not. So that's a current asset called stationery. But for Officeworks, that's a bit different. Do they hold this type of asset primarily to resell or trade it? Yeah, they do. That's their business. Their primary business is making and selling stationery. So therefore, this pen is actually inventory. And we always assume that inventory will be sold within 12 months. And if it's sold within 12 months, that is a current asset called inventory. So that's a little bit tricky. Don't get too stressed. Just think, if it's something you're unsure about, you'll just get to know them. Cash, accounts receivable, inventory, always current. But for other things, just ask yourself, do we primarily hold this type of asset to resell or trade it? It's either a yes or no answer. If it's yes, then you call it inventory, and you assume all inventory is sold within 12 months, so you call it current. Now, if it's something we buy and we don't intend to resell, like that's not what we do, that's not what our business does, so the answer is no, then just ask, how long do we think we'll own that for? If it's like the stationery, a pen, you assume less than 12 months, just call it a current asset. But if it's like a big property or a car or computers or some equipment, and you think it's reasonable to assume it'll last for more than 12 months, you're going to call it non-current. Don't get too stressed, because you'll just learn them as we do them. We'll do so many that you'll just know what's current and what's non-current. Just one slight trick that we need to talk about before the end of the course, but it's quite a way away. What about this? What about if I'm Nissan and I own a property, and we said that's non-current, but what if I actually do intend to sell it within the next 12 months? Yeah, just park that thought for now. It's not going to come up for a while, but we will deal with it much later in the course.